Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you for joining Gwinnett County Public Library for our author talk with award-winning author Jeffrey Blount. My name is Miriam Mayer and I am an adult services specialist for Gwinnett County Public Library. Today our guest author will discuss his newest novel, Mr. Jimmy from Around the Way. And then we will open up the floor for questions. Now I would like to introduce our guest author. Jeffrey Blount is the award-winning author of 3 novels, including The Emancipation of Evan Walls, which won the 2020 National Indie Excellence Award for African American Fiction. He is also an Emmy Award-winning television director and a 2016 inductee to the Virginia Communications Hall of Fame. During a 34-year career at NBC News, Jeffrey directed a decade of Meet the Press, The Today Show, NBC Nightly News, and major special events. Please welcome Jeffrey Blount.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here with you. I'm happy to be in any space where there are people who love books and love talking about them and love talking about the impact that books can have on all of us as individuals and communities. So I want to start today by telling you the story of Mr. Jimmy, the backstory of the book. And all good stories begin with once upon a time. Once upon a time, I was driving my car and listening to the radio, and I heard an author discussing the origin of ideas. And when she was asked where she found the ideas for her novels, she said, ideas are just always around. But she said, she didn't actually find the ideas for her novels, but rather they found her. And she asked her audience to imagine an infinite number of tiny but brilliant lights that surrounded each and every one of us every moment of every day, much like the fairies that populate the dreams of children's stories. And she says these idea fairies are looking for human beings whose creative hearts and minds are always open and always, always searching. And when they find that compatible spirit, they land on their shoulder and create the moment we know of as the light bulb moment. And she said the light bulb moment, historically speaking, is when our greatest works of literature, music, and art are created. I turned down the radio at this point because it's a little out there for me. And I have some questions. And the first one is, was she smoking? Because this is some real 1960s flower child kind of philosophy. And but she was on NPR, so I'm figuring they got her there for a reason. That she's saying something they want us to hear, but I wasn't getting it. So I have a friend, Susan, who I worked with for over 20 years at NBC. Is the most level-headed, she was a producer, the most level-headed person I know. But Susan's also an artist. She's a painter and a very fine writer. So I call up Susan. I say, Susan, you got to hear about the idea fairies. And I tell her. And she, on the phone, I hear, and I say, what's that all about? And she said, it's relief. It's comfort. And I say, for what? And she said, because I understand what she's saying. She says, I have these moments where things come to me and they just happen. And then I am forced to acknowledge them by being creative. It makes me greet them in a creative manner. And sometimes it happens to me in so many, it just happens over and over again that I feel overwhelmed. And I said, well, I have never been overwhelmed by any of this, but it's incredible that Miss Level-Headed Susan feels this same way. And she's a friend of mine. So I trust in her. I don't know this author, but I trust in her. So I better go back and do some more research and think. And the truth is, it does happen this way. And it's happened to me that way. That things will come out of the blue. And whether they land on your shoulder or not, they hit you and force you to think creatively about it. An example would be, I'm back in my car again, and I'm turning onto a street that I'm going to. And my GPS lady said, you are about to turn onto the destination road. And I heard destination road. I heard light bulb. And whether I wanted to or not, my brain started spinning. I started thinking, ooh, what kind of story would go here? What kind of plot would go here? How about some characters and all the things that could occur to make this title worthy? That's how it happened. But that's in my head, and still is in my head, rattling around. I haven't done anything with that. So let me tell you one that actually turned into something. So my daughter is 33. And when she was in second grade, she met Emily. And those two girls became the closest friends you could imagine. I have a daughter and a son. Emily is my second daughter. And she just had her first child. So we're all very excited about all that. But in their senior year of high school, we have this big kitchen and open family room kind of area. There were about 17 kids in the house. And they were about to make a couple of vats of spaghetti and talk too loud, play music too loud, laugh too loud, and all the kind of stuff that my wife and I love because we love having them at our house. So I walked into the melee, and Julia's over here and Emily's over here. Julia looks at Emily, Emily looks back at Julia, Julia makes a face, Emily makes a face, Julia laughs, Emily laughs, they shake their head, turn and walk away. Light bulb moment. I walk upstairs to Jean and I said, you know that Julia and Emily are like an old married couple. They just had a conversation and never said a word. And it hit me, friendship. Friendship hit me, whether it landed on my shoulder or not, and it said, you have to document this. You've got to be creative about it. And the only way I knew how to be creative was to write. So eventually a novella called Hating Heidi Foster came out of that. And I gave it to the girls and I said, I want you to carry it with you so that when you move from your college dorm room, and I knew they were going to be separated, halfway the country, so they wouldn't be near each other in college. You graduate, you get an apartment, you get a second apartment, you move into your house. Every time you touch that book and you put it on a shelf, you will remember your friendship and the power of friendship. And that is why I was moved to write this book. So Susan and I also had, as a part of our conversation, where did this come from? Why do we feel like we were these open people, that we're open to the idea fairies, that they would come and sit on our shoulders? I wondered, I'm a humanities kind of guy, so I wondered if I was a Mr. Spock kind of all facts, all logic, math and science guy, if I would have walked into that room and seen my daughter, and I would have noticed the moment because it's my daughter, and hopefully it would have touched me. And maybe I would have talked about it at Thanksgiving, but I would have never been moved to be creative about it and to make something for them. So why did that happen to me? So Susan and I asked, are we born with this? Is it like when you hear the athletes say, this is our God-given talent that's on display? Well, we couldn't answer that. But I couldn't stop thinking about the process now that I had talked to Susan and I'd gotten really into it. So I decided, after some thinking, that there are two reasons why I believe that I'm open to this kind of creativity. Number one, I grew up on a small farm. I grew up on a small farm in southeastern Virginia, a little town called Smithfield, Virginia, which we like to call the ham capital of the world. And when you grow up on a farm, particularly if you work a farm, you spend a lot of time alone. My father, I think about the hours over the decades that he spent by himself on a tractor, all these hours every day working. And I would go out with my brothers, and I would end up spending time alone by myself. We'd be spread out all over the field. And the first thing I did was, you become one with nature, as they say. You learn to be outside, you love being outside. It was during that time that I fell in love with the mourning dove, the call of the mourning dove, which is my favorite bird call. And I also would just think and reflect about everything in my life. I would take home, arguments at school. Why did this kid say this to this kid? And why did this kid react that way? And, would this relationship ever get back together? Why do people do these things to begin with? What's the point? What's the context? I would hear a sermon at church and take it into the field and say, what did the minister mean? And do I agree with him? And I would read an article in the paper and I would take it out in the field. And I'd spend, half hour or more hour trying to decide what was right or what was wrong about this commentary that I was reading. And over time, I started to want more information. I started to want more ideas. And then when those ideas came in, I tried to make sense of those ideas. And making sense of those ideas became a creative movement, which I think helped me to be open to the idea fairies. Number two was mentorship. And it started with me my freshman year of college. We're getting into the first semester of freshman year. I've written 2 English papers. In the first one, I get an A+. The second one, I get a come to my office and see me. So I'm thinking the only thing she can think is that there's plagiarism going on here. That this country boy can't write this way, can't have this vocabulary, can't have this thinking process. And I was going into to her office prepared to throw down. We're going to have an argument because this is me, this is my writing, and you're going to have to acknowledge that and get to know me so you know what I can do. So I walk in all heated and ready to have a fight, and I sit down, and the first thing she said to me is that you don't belong in my class. Why are you in my class? It's freshman year, I'm a freshman. I'm supposed to be in your class. And she said, but you're not, because you write too well to be in my class, and it's never going to do you any good. And so we started to have this conversation, and I was just stunned. And she said, I know kids like you. I know you've been trying to write poetry. I know you probably have some short stories, but I was still like I was in class, so I'm raising my hand. I am trying to write my first novel. And she said, great, here's what we're going to do. You're going to work on your novel for your homework, and then instead of coming to class 2 times a week, you're coming into my office. You're going to sit at that desk over there, and we're going to edit your book. We're going to talk about characters, and we're going to talk about plot. We're going to do all this stuff because that's where you are, and you shouldn't be in the freshman class. And I also have a friend of mine who is a really good writer, and he loves to give advice. And he has a whole lot to say, so you need to talk to him. So I call him up, and I ask him the question that I think everybody asks, what advice do you have for the would-be author? And she said he had a lot to say, so I had one of those old yellow long legal pads, and I had the pen, and I was ready to write. And he said, listen. One word, listen. And he let it just sit there, and it was awkward in the beginning, but then I realized he was letting it breathe. He wanted me to think about it. And then he said, Jeffrey, what if you wanted to write a bar scene, about a conversation in a bar with some people? Here's what I would suggest. You go into the bar, you sit, and you get a beer or whatever, but you don't talk to anybody. You absorb the atmosphere, and you see what's going on around you. And then I want you to eavesdrop. That's right, I want you to listen to people's conversations. And I want you to recognize or try to put into context what they're saying as opposed to what their bodies are doing. What they're saying as opposed to whether they really are happy or really are sad. I want you to know, and this is something that I've always carried with me and I still think about, I want you to know that every word is deeper than the superficial meaning we have in the dictionary because they're attached to so many different human emotions. And when you get all of that together, you'll be able to go back and write your story. Listen. And that's the greatest piece of advice I ever got as a writer, and it was great for me as I went into the news business because you can't be a good journalist if you can't listen well. And so after all of this, I'm here to tell you that I am a fan of the idea fairies because I realize that I am a part of that for whatever reason, and that I do feel touched by moments and a move to do things. All of my work, my 2 novellas, Hating Honey Foster, which I just talked about, Almost Snow White, come from moments in time. The Almost Snow White was my father and my maternal grandmother just having a conversation. The Emancipation of Evan Walls is a life story, but the genesis for it, the moment that I decided to do it, was reading a newspaper article about a 10-year-old boy that started that book. And I'm a little bit kind of ashamed that it took me to get to 60 years old before I understood the creative process that was happening in my body and in my mind. I'm jealous of the fact that they're young people who get it so early. A good friend of mine's daughter is in her late 20s. She's a musician, and she posted recently on Instagram, I have always promised myself to be aware and to be ready to accept the creative urges when they come knocking on the door of my soul. And I thought, I wish I was there at 28, but I'm happy and I'm glad to be in that situation. And so this leads me to tell you about the beginning of Mr. Jimmy from Around the Way, which is a lot more complicated. Mr. Jimmy from Around the Way is more than just one light bulb moment. And it starts during COVID. March 7th, 2020, I come home from Texas, having been at a book event, and I get in the house, and I'm going to be home for a few days and go back out on the road, except for the fact that my publicist calls and said, Jeffrey, I'm very sorry to tell you that the tour is over because of lockdown, because of COVID. And so I sit at home, like everybody else, my wife, Jean, and I, we circle our wagons and, and we stay in the house and we wave to our neighbors across the street. And I spend a lot of time alone on my back porch, which is like being in the field for me. It's where I write a lot. And in the mornings, in the spring and summer, I can hear the call of the mourning dove there. So it's one of my special places. My mom she's gone now, but she had dementia and she was in a facility. My dad was home on the farm by himself. And so I called him a lot. And we would have these conversations that made us, reflect. And it was a nice thing. And I think it gave us both some comfort. And he told me, we talked about one thing that happened to me when I was 7 years old. I was in the second grade, Mrs. Moore's second grade class. And my superpower then was reading. And I could read well above my grade level. So into my class one day walks this guy who's 13 years old in the second grade. He sits down and we find out that, I'm calling him John Doe, didn't know how to read. He came from a farm family, but his family decided that all of the kids had to work the farm because that's the only way they could make it work. And so he hadn't been to school. Somebody convinced him that he needed to learn to read and have basic math skills. So there he was sitting in a room with a whole bunch of kids who could be his little brothers and little sisters. And I was given the job of being his reading buddy. Obviously, Mrs. Moore was his teacher, and she was good at teaching people to read, but I was there to help make him comfortable. So during breaks and during recess, I would read with John. And I was 7, so I was, as much as I ended up liking him, I was resentful also because I wanted my free time. I wanted to be out on the playground. So when I was 15, my parents came clean. They said, we knew about John the whole time. And we bought his books. When he walked in the classroom holding books, we bought those books. And we bought him clothes so that when he went to school, he wouldn't feel ashamed about the clothing that he wore. Now, back then, my dad was the farmer. My mom was a kindergarten teacher at the church kindergarten. I knew, and they had their own 3 kids, so I knew that they were stretching financially to do this for John. And it made me proud of them. But then they said, we were the ones who went to Mrs. Moore and suggested that you be the reading partner. And I said, why is that? And they said, because we wanted you were old enough to know and to begin to realize that you were on this earth for more than just yourself. That you were on this earth to recognize that you are to provide service to your fellow human being in need. And this situation created that moment for you. And so it became something, it was my first time that my parents taught me about that kind of kindness, which I have called now, when I deal with Mr. Jimmy, the activism of kindness. And that is what I'm here to talk about. So the first light bulb moment with Mr. Jimmy was this conversation with my father. And then I waited. Then I was forcing it because I was excited. I knew that this was the legacy I wanted to leave behind with this book. So I was excited. I'm ready for the rest of the fairies to come along, but it doesn't happen. And then I realized, of course, the idea of fairies must be like the tooth fairy. If you stay up late and wait for it, it ain't coming. You're not getting your money. So you can't force it. So I remember when I played football, and you've heard it over and over again, coaches will say to the best player on the team who is struggling, and the coach will say, stop working so hard. Stop trying to make it happen. Let the game come to you. So I said, well, all right, well, I'm just going to sit on the porch and do my thing. So Jean and I, my wife and I, are sitting on the porch one day, and we start having a conversation about her. She was an anchor and correspondent at CNN. She and her crew who had gone down to Louisiana, and they gotten lost. And they went through this neighborhood, and she called me and she said, Jeffrey, you would not believe the poverty that I saw. That this is in the United States of America is just startling to the heart and the mind. And I thought, okay, light bulb number 2. I know the legacy I want to leave, and now there's a community in my mind that can fit into this whole thing of the activism of kindness. And so I start doing what you do. You start researching. And I'm looking and I'm calling friends who are in the journalism world, who are in places that are known for their poverty, and asking about them. And they send me to places to do research. I go on YouTube and I start looking. And I find it's not really a documentary. I don't call it official, but it's a video made by a woman who's working for a nonprofit. And she's asking people, she's in a neighborhood like Jean described, and she's asking people about their lives. And she's talking to a couple, a tall, thin man, and his arm is out. His wife fits perfectly under there. Both of them are wearing threadbare clothes. You can tell that, that these are people who don't have a lot just by looking at him. His hair is uncombed. He doesn't have a fair amount of teeth. And he starts to tell about his life as a sharecropper. But he's been kicked out of his house because he was sick. And if you can't work, they kick you out of the house because they want people who work in the land. And so he's standing in front of this dilapidated house that would have been condemned in any place where they cared about human beings. And he starts talking and he says, you know, he's trying to use these big words and he's trying to tell the woman, you know, what he's going to do, and his Christmas is coming and he's going to get something for his kids and all these things. And I start to realize what was happening. You know, when I worked in network television, when people came on TV, they wanted to be at their best because they're being recorded. And nowadays it's going to be on the internet forever, right? And in Washington, you have media trainers that train people to go on the air so that they can look their best, and that when we see them, we offer respect to them because of the power that they have and the way they're in control of themselves and all of that when they come on camera. They want to be relevant to us and mean something to us. And I realized that is what was happening with this man. He was trying to use all the words and they came out wrong, and he was trying to speak as if he'd been to college and he hadn't. And I started to think of in the late 60s, and when the sanitation workers in Memphis were walking down the street and they all had the big placards and it said, "I am a man." And I started thinking that this man is trying to say the same thing. He's looking in the camera and he's saying to her, saying to all of us who are watching, "I am a man." But it's not working for him. And his wife is feeling it. And the whole time she's beginning to cry a little bit more, a little bit more. And at one point she can't take it anyway and she just breaks off and walks off the camera. Light bulb moment, the sharecropper. So I now know who is going to be maybe a leader in my community when we talk about the activism of kindness. I continue watching and I find there's a young mother who has a whole bunch of kids around her, and none of the kids, I wonder what time of year is it, or should they be in school? But then when you hear them talk, they don't have any control over the language either. And she's missing teeth also, and her house is dilapidated, and I started thinking about my kids and the benefits that they had at that age and these kids, and how the circle was just going to continue. Because if nobody was there to stop it for them, it would just continue and continue. A light bulb moment. I had the mother and the children and the children's need for education, which is a very big deal with me, and is in my book, The Emancipation of Evan Wallace, too. Literacy for children is a huge thing. So then I go through another period where nobody's coming to visit me, there are no light bulb moments, but I know now and I'm beginning to craft things. And I talked to my daughter, I talked to Julia on the phone because I wouldn't see Julia for 16 months once COVID started. And so we spent a lot of time talking on the phone. She's on the West Coast. And we had some great times together. We took a father-daughter tour through the South to all the civil rights places to stop and see. We just had we still have a wonderful relationship. And I was thinking about the last thing we had done together that was powerful. We went to see Brian Stevenson of the Equal Justice Initiative speak. And at one point he said, "We are all worth more than the worst thing we've ever done." And boom, that was a big light bulb moment, because I had been carrying a whole thing in my head about redemption and who could find redemption if they'd done something wrong. How could we find it? So now I had a person that maybe was looking for redemption, that maybe could end up in this town with the sharecropper and the woman and the kids, and maybe we could have something happening here. What would I do with, who could this guy be? And then one day I'm reading the paper and I started reading about a black billionaire, and I'm thinking, well, this is unusual. I don't usually read about billionaires anyway, but especially black billionaires, and the only two I can think of was Oprah and Dr. Dre at the time. And now I'm reading about this man named Robert Smith, who's worth $8 billion. Who's the wealthiest black person in the country. And he has had a kind of a fall from grace. Started with not paying his taxes and maybe some other stuff. And he had been on television and all these things, and his star was shining. He had been to an HBCU and stood up and said, you know, everybody here is going to graduate with no debt. I'm paying off everything. And it would cost him $34 million to do it. But now his star had lost its luster. What was he going to do? And I thought, light bulb moment. I got a black billionaire. I got a sharecropper. I got a woman with children in need. I got a community, and I got the idea of kindness, of the activism of kindness. And the last thing I need is for the billionaire to show us what a village is, and that we need more than just him. We need more than just money. We need people to care about each other and see each other's humanity. And it shouldn't just be a black billionaire. So there's a white character, there's a woman named Olivia Fay Carroll in the book for a reason, to show that all of us should be required to help all of us, and it doesn't matter what we look like. And the thing I'm trying to get across in that comes out in this story that, from my life, that I like to tell. I was on a highway in 95 North, just north of New York, on my way to Maine with my kids and my wife. And a white panel van starts swerving across the lanes. So all the traffic is slowing down. Nobody wants to get hit by this guy. And at one point, it flips over on its side and slides off onto the shoulder of the road. Now, the traffic is already stopped because nobody wanted to get caught up in what was happening with him. I get out of my car, people get out of their cars, and everybody's running to this van. Now, here's what I didn't know, and what I think nobody else knew, because we were all way behind him trying not to get hit while we were running to the van. We didn't know if he was black, if he was white, if he was Asian, if he was Latino, if he was anything else. We didn't know if he was gay. We didn't know if he was straight. We didn't know if he was Jewish, Muslim, Buddhist. We didn't know anything except the fact that there was a human life at risk. In that split second, it was all about the humanity. And all of these other filters, all the politics and everything else was gone. We were just trying to save a life, because in here we all know that lives are worthy. And the UN state, there's part of the UN statement that says every human being is born free and equal in dignity and rights. And that's what we were trying to save that night, without knowing who was there. And that is what I'm trying to bring to the table, the legacy I'm trying to leave with Mr. Jimmy from around the way. So all of those light bulb moments came together to create a story and a legacy about human beings helping each other. I am not naive. I know that we have all of these many conflicts in our lives, in terms of people seeing each other, in terms of people using things not to see each other. But my parents always told me that we never stop, that we are consistently trying to do things to better ourselves, and we don't allow negative things to stop us from being who we are. One day I was on Granby Street in Norfolk, Virginia with my parents, and they had given some money to this guy on the street. And I said, what if he doesn't go buy food like you said? You know, what if he goes and buys some liquor or something? And I must have been about 8 or 9. And my mother said to me, well, all it means, if he does that, that's sad. That's not what we did. But I want you to ask yourself what it says about you. You did the right thing. What was in your heart was right. And that's what you need to focus on and continue moving forward. So that is what Mr. Jimmy is all about. Muhammad Ali said, service to others is the rent we pay for our room here on earth. Thank you for listening to me. And I'd like to open up for any questions that you might have.
Can you use a small passage?
Do you really want that? Because I don't usually read, because my agent, like I said, you know, authors are not actors. You know, and so maybe, so you will be the first person that first group I've ever read for. So
We feel honored.
okay, let me see.
We don't buy.
Okay, this will probably only take a minute or so. A deep, full breath accompanied his first steps. Country air seemed to be the same everywhere, he thought. Lung candy, his mother sometimes called it, fresh and sweet. The soft crunching sound of his shoes in the unsophisticated dirt also brought him comfort. Even the old for sale sign added to his rustic, bucolic sensibility. His eyes smiled. The grasses in the field were beginning to show the first sign of their autumn browning. Soon the leaves would be turning, boasting a palette of gold, brown, and orange. This is why he came here, to hear nothing but birds and the rooster's morning call, to be in a space that reminded him of a simpler time in his life where good, kind people were living good, decent lives, striving to better themselves in a less complicated world. But the joke really was on him, fully, because Ham, Mississippi was not the world that James Henry Ferguson had in mind. And that's the part of the book where he runs away to find comfort in the rural town. And what I've done, I've given him, so if you're a kid and you do something wrong and your parents yell at you or your siblings yell at you, you run to your room, you shut the door, and you get in your bed, and that's your comfort zone. So Mr. Jimmy's comfort zone is to go back to the rural South, where his father is a preacher and had been a preacher, and he wants to go home that way and to live in a simpler life away from all of the stuff that is coming down, the media and all of the things that have happened to him after his fall from grace. And he has broken his family, he's broken his reputation, and he needs a place to recuperate. And then he finds himself with this community mired in abject poverty. And he slowly grows into this community, and then something really tragic happens in this community. And it takes everything he has to save himself, to keep trying to find his redemption, as well as to keep this whole community from dissolving into disaster. So, so anyway, that was the point. That's when he gets there, and he's stepped out of his house for the first time, and he's about to take a walk down through the neighborhood called Around the Way. Anyone else? No, go ahead.
Did your idea of Mr. The billionaire,
Yes,
and the poverty-stricken neighborhood in was it New Orleans?
No, it's Ham, Mississippi is where, yeah. Mhm.
Did that ever come together? Did you ever get him to contribute?
Oh, Mr. Jimmy?
No. The
real guy.
Oh, the real people. No,
real life.
no, I did never ask. No,
Oh, okay.
no. And in fact, you know, you just take pieces. You know, I think there's a T-shirt or that says something like, "Alert! I am an author. Be careful what you say or do because it might end up in my next book." So when I do my research, I find these situations, and then I take, it would be great. His name is Robert Smith. There's also a couple, David and Thelma Stewart, and also he was a billionaire in the tech business, and the two of them together, there's a picture of the two of them online that I always had in my head when I was writing Mr. Jimmy. It's a very, very elegant, you can just tell by looking at her, smart, brilliant woman and a tall, handsome husband. And both of them are also huge, or they do a lot of philanthropy in the community. So I wanted to continue that, because most of the time we just hate billionaires. And it's true. I mean, a lot of billionaires aren't doing themselves any favor. But there are good people who have money and trying to do good things. And I also, the main reason that I made him a billionaire, when I stumbled onto that, I said, this is perfect for me. I used to talk to DC public school students, and I would go into classrooms that were majority Black and Latino. And the idea was for African American and Latino professionals to go in and talk to the kids to let them know what kind of opportunities they had. And so I would ask the question, what would you want to do in life? Because my parents always said that you don't say what you want to be in life, because you're going to be you. You're going to have to create you, but what do you want to do? So I would ask them that. And I can't think of a time where it didn't happen, where the majority of the kids said, I want to be an athlete, I want to be an entertainer, or that kind of thing. It never happened where somebody said, I wanted to be an astronaut, I wanted to be a lawyer, I want to be that. And so I wanted Mr. Jimmy to be an example of the possibilities. You can make the same money, if not more, doing what they did, being smart, being a creative business person. LeBron's got a lot of money, but they don't have what Robert Smith, he doesn't have what Robert Smith has. So, and you can get there just using your mind. You might think, I don't have the physical ability to dance or to be an athlete. What will I do with myself? Read. Starts with reading. So one time I went up to give a speech and to talk, and the woman who introduced me by telling giving my resume and the resume of my two older brothers. And when I stood up to speak, a girl in the audience just yelled out, "You lie," because she didn't have faith to believe that 3 Black boys from a farm in rural Virginia could have successful careers. And that's what I was trying to break by going and doing those talks. And that's why Mr. Jimmy is a billionaire.
I love that you mentioned the importance of mentorship.
Yes.
So thank you for that. And also this month is National Mentor Month.
Oh, I didn't know that. How about that? Yes.
And Sunday is Thank Your Mentor Day, so thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. It's a big part of what I do, and I was just telling Annelle about a young man who I've been mentoring for a while, since he read my book, The Emancipation of Evan Walls, and related to the character in a way, and how we both changed each other's lives. So, go ahead.
I have a few comments. Is that the Emancipation of Evan Walls?
Yes.
Okay, good, because it wasn't available on Amazon. That's
Oh,
what I'm
okay.
thinking. So number one, I'm jealous that you got to meet Brian Stevenson.
Yes.
That's one of my favorite quotes, that we are more than our worst day.
Right,
So
yeah.
thank you for that. And then I noticed on both covers, there's a house.
Yes.
Is there significance that you made those covers kind of similar?
So, I consider myself proudly as a Southern author. And I say that because a lot of times I want people to remember that, at least at NBC, I used to have to fight the battle. People would say, urban, and they always say that to mean Black. And I would stand up in editorial meetings and control them and say, no, it means urban, because there are Black people living in the South, there are Black people living in the rural South, there are Black people still living on farms like my Uncle Theron and other folks. So there's a there's a rural part that I think is important to be here, and a legacy that I think as a writer I should be writing about. So on the cover of The Emancipation of Evan Walls, the publisher had me send pictures from my life that I felt was attached to the story. So there was a bicycle I sent and some other things. And I sent my grandfather's house, which was on the corner of this, and the land goes out like this, and along this is all the farm, my grandfather, my Uncle Miles, my Aunt Connie, my Uncle Theron, and us, and all of my grandfather's land. So now I forgot the question you were asked, because I'm going off on. Oh, right. So part of what was lovely about growing up in that space was the houses and the porches. One of the reasons I love being on my porch is the same thing. On the front of the Emancipation of Evan Walls, you'll see the silhouette of a little boy standing at the door of the porch. And the whole first chapter happens on a porch. And so the housing, the front porch was like, or the back porch, however, on your house was the church away from church. And so I just feel, part of me just loves to represent that. And so Mr. Jimmy rebuilds a house when he moves to that neighborhood. It's a house sight unseen. He buys it, never goes into it. He just has them renovated, and he shows up and finds out what he's next to. But then he wants to try and help people who are in bad situations, including their housing, change their lives. So the house is a big thing in both of the stories. And when Beaufort Books sent the cover to me, I immediately called my agent. I said, Marley, I'm going to have 2 books with houses on the cover. Is that a problem? And she said, no, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. So we let it go. And but I think it certainly represents part of my comfort zone, being on the porch and sitting at the feet of the elders and listening to them talk, and people. And when I was out with that book, people said, you know, was asked a question. I can't remember why the conversation came up, but it was asked about music and things, because there's a part in the book where they're singing in the church and it's nighttime and all that. And we started talking about the music of your life. And I said, well, the music of my life isn't Michael Jackson or Earth, Wind and Fire or anything like that. It's the voices of the old people who I sat next to, my great-grandmother and my Aunt Frances, and you know, all of them talking, and the way they spoke, the way they laughed. That's the music of my youth, and that's what I tried to bring in The Emancipation of Evan Walls. And you will see that in Miss Septima, who is one of my favorite characters in this book. And you will see that reflection of me, of what I picked up in that story.
Did you have the title? I noticed you mentioned vignettes or, you know,
Right.
Idea
Right.
That came. But Mr. Jimmy from Around the Way,
Yeah.
did you build around that title, or you built Mr. Jimmy from Around the Way based on your idea, Fairy?
That's a great question. That's a great question. And the answer is that I built it, Mr. Jimmy came later. The title came later. And there's a great question, because I had this thing in my head that I just told you earlier, that Destination Road, that I was thinking of the title. But I didn't have the title probably until I was 3/4 of the way through it. And I wanted Mr. Jimmy to be a man who knew how to love, a man who could accept love, a man who could be kind in an open and emotional kind of way. You know, my father is a big man, big hands, and a farmer, and one of the things that my father's greatest strength was his gentleness. And that's what I wanted Mr. Jimmy to have. So Mr. Jimmy, James Henry Ferguson, the real name in here, was a real man. And he in Philadelphia, he lived with my grandmother. My grandmother spent most of her adult life in Philadelphia. And Mr. Jimmy was gay, but we didn't talk about it then. We didn't deal with it then. But whenever we went to visit my grandmother, Mr. Jimmy treated us like we were his grandchildren. And he was so full of love. He was funny. He laughed. He made us laugh. He was affectionate, and I grew up just carrying that love with me. And I grew up regretting the fact that when my grandmother remarried and moved with my step-grandfather, we lost track of Mr. Jimmy. And I know he left Philadelphia, but I don't know where he went. And I'm sure he's gone now, but I wanted to say thank you. Because, you know, there are precious few people in your lives that touch you in certain ways. And Mr. Jimmy was a person that you could be in his presence for, you spend the night having a dinner with him, and you will feel better about yourself. You feel better about your life. You feel better about people, because he could do that to you. And that's why, that's where the name came from. And that's where, and the around the way, it was, at least for me, a colloquialism in my hometown, where black folks would just say, you know, around the way. You wake up and you say, how are you doing today? Well, it's another day, you know, it's another tough day around the way. And so I just wanted to add that to it, because it's the flavor of, you know, this community, which is called Around the Way, because so much stuff is happening all the time around the way. Never a quiet day. Go ahead.
Did you start out doing writing, or did you do something else as a profession and then you flipped into this?
I had a career in television news. I worked at NBC, and I directed Meet the Press, Today Show, Night News, and stuff like that. But my writing started when I was in high school. I had a job where I'd go to the local paper, the Smithfield Times, and I was on the janitorial staff after school, and just go and help them clean up and stuff like that. And we were having a big argument in town about whether or not we should build a new high school. And some of the parents were writing some very mean-spirited things in my mind in letters to the editor saying that we shouldn't have a school, and it's because of the kids, a bunch of feral kids who can't really take care of the schools they have, so why should we have a new school? I don't want to give my tax dollars to this. So I wrote a letter to the editor to fire back at the parents. So the managing editor at the time called me to his office, and then he said, follow me, and he took me down to the hallway to Mr. Phillips, who was the publisher, the owner of the paper. So they sat me down and made me a cub reporter. And, and Mr. Edwards then taught me what journalism was, taught me how to write for journalism, but he also told me in the beginning that I had writing talent. And then he was the one who put me in the car, put me in a car and drove me to the university that I would end up going to introduce me to the journalism department there. And he gave me faith that I could do this. So I was writing all the time. I never stopped writing. And in fact, as I got closer to the end of my television career, I started writing. A friend of mine had a very wildly successful production company called Cortina Productions, and he does documentaries and things for museums. So I would write scripts for his documentary. So I have 6 films in the Muhammad Ali Center. I have 2 things in the African American History Museum in DC, in the Jimmy Carter Presidential Center, and on, working with him and writing those. So I have always been writing. I've never not written. I just, when I knew when I left the news business, I wanted to try my hand at writing, you know, real novels and hoping for real impact. So that's sort of the, you know, step by step for me. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Are your books available in audio? That's a 2-part question.
Yes. No for Evan Walls. Mr. Jimmy is coming. Probably in a month. It's being, and the reason why it's delayed is because I wanted, there's Governor Westmore of Maryland did the other Westmore. So the guy who read that, I wanted to read Mr. Jimmy. He wasn't available, but he's reading it now. So so mid-February, 1st of March, it will be up and ready. Yeah.
The second part of my question was if they are available in audio, do you have input? So it does sound like you have input.
Yes, yes.
And I have a book club, and we're reading a book now. And I read the book last year, and a lot of our readers are listeners.
Right.
And the narration is so horrible they can't appreciate the story
Yes.
that's in the book. So, this sounds like a good story. So I'm glad you have input on this author didn't have any input.
Right,
On their,
right.
Narrator, so I'm glad you have that because it makes such a difference.
It is. I mean, my agent will say that if it's a poorly read book, she'd rather you just not have an audio version. So that's why we waited for Earl Sewell, and yeah,
I
and
might listen to it.
and I think he can give Mr. Jimmy the proper voice, but he can also give the other characters a proper voice. I think his breadth of character portrayals is what I liked a lot. And so he's a guy who's in high demand, and I hope that it comes out well.
He's a mayor now.
Yeah, no, right. That's right. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry.
Talking about writing, you have the writing talent from young age.
Yes.
And for us, whose native language is not English,
Yes.
do you have any suggestions or secrets you can share to improve the writing potential?
I do, and it's the same thing I give people whose native language is English, is to read good writing. That is the key to read. If you can find an author who has a tone and a voice that you like, that speaks to you, that you're comfortable hearing and listening to and deciphering and understanding, read, because that's how you absorb what you can turn around into writing. It's sort of the same thing that the guy gave me to listen, when he told me to listen, is you have to find a voice that you're comfortable with. So for me, it's James Baldwin, Toni Morrison, Alice Hoffman, and John Irving. Those writers, I read everything they wrote, and it helped inform me about how I wanted to create my own voice. And so I really, to me, and it sounds like maybe it's too simple to be true, but I have told people this over and over again, and I think it is the magic sauce. You can't write well unless you read good writing. And that's what I would say to you. I would just keep reading books that make you feel like you're learning something more than the story, that you're learning from the writing, how they structure a sentence. You're learning how, like Alice Hoffman writes in many ways, her earlier books, she writes very simply, but the simple words create incredible imaging. And, so when you hear her words, you see it in your head. And I wanted to add that to me. So that's, and it may not, I'm sorry if it's not sufficient, but that's my advice to you, is to read someone you love and to try and take it apart. Not just the story, but the writing, the tone, how they're doing it, and ask, how would I rewrite this story? How would I tell that story? And I think you grow that way into being able to do it. But certainly I think for me, that's the most powerful way. Okay. Oh, no problem. That's a good question. And actually, I've never been asked that before, so that's a unique question.
Do you have any current reading recommendations?
There is the Girl in the Red Rose. You read that already, Susan? Did you read it already? Oh, okay.
I've met her a couple of times.
Oh, okay. So I'm going to be doing a book event with her. There is a book called High Yella by Steve. Have you heard of it? It's a memoir. Steve Majors. It is fantastic. I have not read a memoir that I've been moved by like that in a long time.
Is it High Yellow?
High Yella, Hayella. Yeah. Steve Majors is the name. In fact, I got him to read this one so he could give me a quote, because I wanted people, when they read his book, to feel like, oh yeah, if Steve wrote that, then I want to read this book, because his book is so good.
The Girl in the Red Rose, I apologize.
The Girl in the Red Rose Motel. Yeah. Let me see. I read so much that hold on a second.
Have you read The Last Thing You Surrender by Louis Pitts?
I have it in my Kindle to read while I'm on tour. Yeah, yeah, have that in my Kindle. Yeah. Of course, anything, Jesmyn Ward, her new book has just come out. I don't think it's as good as some of her earlier stuff, but it's still her. How about a book that isn't out now, but it's a book called Rush Home Road. And I'm trying to think of the author, but I highly recommend it. It's one of those books where you knew that she felt what she was writing. Robert Frost says, if there's no tears in the writer, there are no tears in the reader. And there were tears. I certainly had tears reading it, and I was certainly moved by it. Lori Lanson, right. Mm-hmm. Rush Home Road, yeah. And if you have access to Goodreads, I couldn't access it here. If you go to my page, there'll be my 12 favorites that I read. Elizabeth Strout, she wrote a book about being during the pandemic. Have you read that one?
I haven't read that.
Okay, so Elizabeth Strout.
Earlier.
Yes, well, her book, I can't remember the title of it, but if you go to her and read about the book, you'll find that it's one about she and her husband who actually were divorced and living together through the pandemic. And you know, Olive Kitteridge is one of my all-time favorite books. I mean, that's just spectacular, and I love her work. So those are some. Yeah.
Start James McBride's new book.
I have that too. I read the first paragraph. When I left home. Yeah. James McBride, yeah, his new book.
He did Deacon King Kong.
Yeah. I read the first paragraph, and it was I was hooked. So that would probably be, I'm going to read Susan's again because we're doing an event next week together. I can find that out for you too. But so we're doing that together, and then I'm going to start that one. But so those are probably the ones that come off the top of my head that I think you might like to read, especially High Yellow. I just love that book. I'm very touched by his journey and figuring out who he was and his family, which was kind of all over the place, and finding out, without needing ancestry, that, your parents aren't who they thought they were, and all of this stuff, and how he has come to create a life. He worked at NBC as well, MSNBC. And this is High Yellow. Yeah. So anyway, it's just one of my all-time favorites. That sounds like we're out of time.
Yeah, I think we're going to go ahead and wrap this up.
Okay. Thank you all so much. I appreciate it very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeffrey, for this wonderful talk.
Thank you.
I think we all learned a little bit about kindness and being kind, and that has a ripple effect in the world. So I hope that everybody can get a copy of Jeffrey's book. We do have Book Miser here selling his book, and he will be signing. So again, thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you all.